Growing up queer in a fundamentalist Catholic world isn't just confusing, it's crushing.
Today, we're talking with Theo, who lived that reality, from youth ministry and purity talks to spiritual direction that veered into conversion therapy.
To finally stepping away, reclaiming their non-binary identity, and calling out the theology that harmed them.
Now, through their podcast Disordered, Theo is breaking down the teachings they once believed and helping others do the same. Be aware, this episode includes discussions of transphobia, conversion therapy, religious trauma, and side B Catholicism.
Sometimes healing starts with naming the harm and refusing to stay silent about it. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
The show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go! What happens when you grow up being told your identity is disordered? And then you realize the disorder was never you.
Today's guest, Theo, was all in on Catholicism, retreats, youth ministry, even dreams of religious life.
But as they began to understand their queerness and non-binary identity, the cracks in the theology began to show.
What followed was a long, painful unraveling, and eventually, a bold decision to speak out.
Through their podcast Disordered, Theo is challenging the Church's teachings on gender and sexuality, and offering a lifeline to others trying to make sense of their own stories. Before listening to this episode, take a beat. This episode includes discussions of transphobia, conversion therapy, religious trauma, and side B Catholicism.
This is a conversation about survival, deconstruction, and sacred defiance. Today, we are excited to welcome Theo to the podcast. Theo is a non-binary person who grew up in a Catholic household and completed their degree in theology at a Catholic university. They created the podcast Disordered, responding to Catholic teachings on gender and sexuality to use their own deconstruction process and difficult experiences in the church to help others struggling with similar experiences. It is available on Spotify. Theo, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Typically, when we've had guests on the podcast, one of the great joys is learning about the lived experiences of everyone we talk to. So in framing our conversation, we always like to ask, can you share a little bit more about what your Catholic upbringing looked like? If there are any specific experiences that stand out to you or impact who you are today?
Yeah, so I was raised in a pretty conservative Catholic household. We, went to Mass every Sunday. In our family, it was expected that being Catholic informs absolutely everything about your life. I personally got really into my faith when I was a teenager. The parish that we went to had the Life Teen Youth Ministry program. It was really big at our parish as well. And so, I got really kind of into my faith there. We had 2 retreats every year, and I don't think I missed a single one throughout all of high school. And then things kind of started to change, mostly in college, as I kind of explored more about the church's teachings and my feelings about being LGBT plus and all of that.
100%. And as a follow-up for that, I really appreciate it. From what we've shared, Theo, you are a cradle Catholic, but you're someone that doesn't identify as Catholic anymore. So you really got involved, as you mentioned, with your faith in high school. And at the same time that you were discovering that you are queer, you were exploring this idea of celibacy and side B. Do you mind sharing more about how you first learned about side B, how you became involved, and what motivated it?
Yeah, so I kind of came for the first time to realize my queerness when I was around 13. And I definitely tried to kind of ignore it for a while. And then when I was a teenager, I don't remember the name of the blog, but I do remember the first like side B blog that I came across and kind of discovered that, oh, okay. So apparently, like, I knew the church's teaching. I knew that, gay people weren't like, couldn't have relationships and everything. But I kind of discovered, okay, so celibacy is an option that some people go for. And that for me, I was initially very enthusiastic about. I definitely wanted to be celibate. I also considered like consecrated life and religious life. But I think at the time I saw celibacy as kind of my way to express my queerness, as a way of diverging from kind of, in my mind, the only options were celibacy and like a heteronormative marriage. And so for me to be celibate was kind of a way to try and express myself, as, yeah, just as diverging from that as being queer.
I really do resonate with that as well. For me, I think it also came from the fact that, like, in youth group, so I wasn't involved with Life Teen, but I was involved in a youth group that did put on twice yearly retreats. So all the kids in the youth group had different roles. We all had talks to give, and they were all like different themed talks. So like it was like a weird thing where everybody kind of got like cast into roles as characters, because you would have like the person who gave the talk about sexuality, and everyone was like, "Yep, that's the super over sexualized person." Like it was like a very weird, weird thing. But yes, I relate because like there would always be the modesty talks. That's what always stands out to me. And so since I'm transgender and I was assigned female at birth, I was in a lot of modesty talks geared towards women and girls. And it was a very weird experience because like there, on the one hand, it was, well, this I don't relate to this, like I don't relate to what they're talking about as issues. Like, and I don't relate this to my own body because even then I had dysphoria, even though I wouldn't have really had the words for it at the time. But there was also a feeling of like, I kind of feel like holier than thou than these people because like, this is not something that like I'm dealing with. So like, I've kind of already aced this, which also could be a funny play since ace is for like asexuality, and like asexuality was something that I felt very connected to because I was like, with kind of like exactly what you said of like this celibacy option kind of does actually feel like a way to express like the queerness, the thing that is different about me. So not to like go off on a huge rabbit trail there, but I do really relate to that idea. And there were also like so many writers like the Spiritual Friendship blog at the time is what I remember reading. Yeah. Did you read that one as well?
Yeah, I remember reading that one. I read Eve Tushnet. I don't know. There were some others as well. But I also definitely experienced like what you were mentioning about the sort of like holier than thou feeling. I definitely had kind of a bit of like some feelings of like self-righteousness or like superiority because of similar things. I didn't really experience that temptation. Like, yeah, I had a lot of very conflicting feelings about my body that I couldn't really identify at the time, part of which was definitely gender dysphoria. And I didn't have the desire to I didn't want anyone looking at my body. And so I didn't understand, why this seemed to be not what everyone else felt. And I, definitely kind of had a bit of an interpretation of like, I must just be like really good at this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I do also want to take a beat to say like, I definitely don't agree or align with most people like Eve Tushnet now for like complex reasons. But I want to say that they did serve a purpose of helping me crack a door into like what would it mean to like allow myself to explore gender or sexuality like just a tiny bit, just a tiny little bit. Like what would that feel like instead of it just being like this amorphous blob of like, I don't know, I don't understand, I can't go there. They were providing some type of structure. I think it's ultimately like kind of like a doomed structure now. I mean, people have their own journey, and I do respect people's own journeys. But for myself, I didn't see it as a pathway to like full flourishing or healthiness or happiness for myself. But yeah, I think it was like an early little crack. Did you have an experience like that too, of like little crack of maybe I can kind of consider this?
Yeah, definitely. Eve Tushnet was definitely someone who I think I have similar feelings where, at least at the time, the fact that she was celibate, and I also in some of her writings also kind of criticized the church a little bit, that sort of gave me permission, I think, for the first time in those earlier stages to say, oh, okay, maybe it is okay for me to like not agree 100% with every decision the church makes or everything the church does. Because at the time, at least, I was so afraid, where if, for a long time, if I knew that someone was, if someone had said, here's this book and it's written by someone who's affirming, I would have been like, nope, get it away from me. Get that book away from me. It's going to lead me to sin. Right. And so those kind of baby steps were important to me, at least at the time. Although definitely now, like, I don't agree with kind of, conclusions from, Eve Tushnet or other writers like that. But at the same time, it did at least give me those kind of like little baby steps.
100%. And I also want to say that, Theo, in your experience, just in researching, Life Teen was something I also grew up with. So just having their specific pages and their stories about journeying with friends with same-sex attraction, Dear Society, You Don't Define Me, critical essays that I remember reading, very much it primed for that understanding. That even their most recent one, Why I Don't Self-Identify as ... has really specific implications about separating from secular media that I think also resonates in high control Catholic spaces, of wanting to shift away from spaces that acknowledge or even affirm that queer and trans people exist.
Yeah, I remember there being one that I read as a teenager, and I don't remember the exact title, but it was something along the lines of like, does the church hate gay people or something like that, right? And the kind of main argument, of course, being that no, the church doesn't hate gay people, but kind of the justification was this idea of, well, this is the circumstances under which it's okay to have sex. Gay couples do not meet these requirements, and therefore their relationship is not loving. Like, it is fundamentally unloving for them to be in a relationship. And that definitely had a really strong impact on me, because I very much did start thinking, like, have that impression that, okay, like, gay relationships are in some sense like fundamentally borderline abusive. Like, you are fundamentally using the other person and not respecting them. And that was really hard for me to kind of overcome later on, and realize that queer relationships are very loving and have just the same capacity for love. And of course, any relationship can be harmful, but being queer is not what makes it harmful at all.
100%. Literally just identifying the specific post that you're talking about. Life Teen International posted on Facebook on October 6, 2014. The Catholic Church does not hate gay people. Changing that stigma begins with each one of us and how we interact with one another and build relationships based on love, truth, and honesty. But first of all, it starts with prayer. And it has a quote from Daniel Glaze: "If you've never prayed for a person's soul, you have no business talking to them about it." And I think also that feeds into ideas of superiority complexes.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like in really growing up, both in my family and in the wider Catholic community I was a part of, there was definitely a lot of like seeing your like relationships with people as this form of evangelization, and that makes it really
Mm-hmm.
hard to have genuine relationship with anyone, even just a friend, because you can never really
Mm-hmm.
fully be honest and be yourself, because you always have this like ulterior motive of like, I need to convince you to see things the way I do. And there was a lot of pressure for me as well to like to be happy all the time, because I was told you need to share your joy of being Christian and being Catholic, and that's how you draw other people to you. And then with being queer, I felt that pressure even more when I was trying to be celibate, because I felt like, okay, I have to be like a walking advertisement for being celibate and like prove to the world that this is a good thing. And if I don't do that, then I'm failing, and people might like people might go to hell because of me. Like, that's so much pressure to put on someone. And it makes it so difficult to have genuine relationship and community.
I think that's a really important point that you highlight about, because so often in like these fundamentalist spaces, whether they're Catholic or not, to be honest, because like for me, when I went through deconstruction, I also went through this phase of like studying all the other ones, like all the ex-Mormon groups, like all the ex-evangelical stuff, partially because that was like the only communities that I saw really grappling with what it means to like disentangle from fundamentalism, but also just out of curiosity, because it was like for so long I had been like, okay, can't think really too deeply about other religions. Like I know they exist, but like there's no point in really like knowing deeply about them. So I let myself indulge a little bit of that knowing. And the pattern in a lot of these fundamentalist groups is like so much based on what it looks like what your performance looks like. Like it's honestly in some cases to the point of like almost parody, where it's like, okay, this is just so not in line with the actual teachings of Jesus. This is so clearly just a performance. But I think for queer people especially, it's very much that feeling of like, how do I like fit in? How do I make myself not like, how do I still like be who I am, because I'm getting the messaging that like God did create me on purpose, but like how do I at the same time fit into this system? How do I play the part? Like so much emphasis on performance and so much pressure on that too.
And pressure that they were putting on children, I think, also ties to levels in which pressure surrounding being responsible for other people's salvation is a level of control against vulnerable communities that are still trying to figure out who they are.
Yeah, and I think as well, yeah, just that feeling of essentially being coerced into believing something, because if you don't believe this, then you're gonna go to hell, or you might go to
Mm-hmm.
hell. And I remember occasionally hearing from people talking about gay Catholics who did not follow the church's teaching, saying, well, then why do you even bother being Catholic? And I would think to myself, well, maybe because didn't you say that they're going to go to hell if they're not, though? So like it was kind of this like weird paradox of like, well, no one's forcing you to be here. And it's like, I mean, you kind of are, because you told me I'm going to be eternally tortured if I don't. So which way is it?
I wanted to ask Theo, from your perspective, we had a chance to talk, and you mentioned a little bit more of how your identity of being Catholic was so intrinsically within this charismatic community tied to being American. I'm really curious, given that right now Max and I are in this high control series and investigating the conflation of those two things and the growth of Catholic nationalism. Do you mind sharing more how that affected your faith identity and how you identify?
Sure. Yeah. In my household, yeah, definitely being Catholic and being American were just kind of seen as these intertwined things that couldn't really be separated. And more specifically as well with like being Republican. Um there was definitely an attitude of like, if you were Catholic and you were a Democrat, then you weren't a real Catholic, because real Catholics are Republicans, and believe in America and American values. And for me, I think that was something that I definitely found kind of confusing growing up. I do remember thinking to myself, like pretty young, aren't there Catholics all around the world though? And like, are all the Catholics supposed to move to America so they can be more Catholic? You know, and like, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, as well, then being like, and wait a minute, Jesus wasn't from America, and this just like doesn't add up. This doesn't make sense to me. But it was, yeah, I was definitely raised with that idea that I don't know, that somehow to be Catholic was to be most authentically American, and vice versa. And I can't even really explain the logic of it to you, because I don't think anyone ever officially gave me a justification or reason for it. It was just kind of a generally accepted thing.
No, that makes sense. And in many ways, when Max and I were exploring elements of Catholic nationalism that I think especially surged after the election of Pope Leo XIV, and even beforehand, it was kind of this adoption of American iconography within Catholic ones. So, like the baby Jesus swaddled in an American flag, Mary wearing an American flag mantilla. Even though, of course, we always think about like desecrating the flag. What are the policies surrounding this? Um, Not to say that I am for or against, but in the same way, I think what you talk about is especially important because the Vatican is not based in the United States. It doesn't take its level and identification within Catholicism from its identification with an American construct.
Yeah, and I think as well for me there was like definitely an assumption, it seemed like growing up, that like if the Catholics are in charge, then everything will be okay. That's what the world needs. That's what the country needs, is for the Catholics to be in charge. And
There it is.
yeah, and I feel like I also remember I don't really remember when, but at some point starting to also think about times in history where the Catholic Church had lots and lots of political power, and thinking to myself, doesn't seem like the church fixed everything that time. So
Yeah.
I don't really see why I should have a lot of faith that it's going to work this time around, you know?
Yeah, it's so fascinating, like the way that history is presented in some of these circles. Like, I was homeschooled from 6th grade through high school, which is like kind of the time when you get into the meatier stuff. And now, granted, we did not use a Catholic curriculum because I was involved largely with a group like that would meet that was Protestant. But even so, a lot of careful editing around the way we would talk about certain things that happened. So it's just very interesting what gets taught and what doesn't get taught, and how we talk about these histories really matter. Because I know Emma, for example, has a very visceral example of some experiences with Catholic presentations of the Crusades that were not exactly accurate.
No, 100% Theo. I had shared it once earlier with Max, that and I've shared pretty widely about my experience with purity culture, being the first time that I really went on a Catholic retreat, and it just being such a traumatic experience, being asked to pray for your future husbands, and me fully, goodness, praying to God, please send him the wrong instructions. But very much so that the next retreat that I went to was all about how the Crusades were a good thing. And it was one thing where my dad and I, two people who really love history, kind of looked at each other, immediately locked eyes, and went, I think we're in the wrong spot. We got off on the wrong station of this train, and this is not okay.
On that theme too, like of purity culture, I didn't experience a purity culture retreat explicitly, but and then also with me being trans, it kind of like complicates all the feelings about those messages in general. But I do remember once being asked to write a letter about like femininity, and when I reread that letter, I just laugh, because it's like the very first line is something along the lines of like, yeah, I never really thought that I never really could see what like the point of being a woman was. Like, I feel like that's the first sentence, like, emotionally. And then by the end, I'm like, yep, it's just what I've got to do. It's just what I've got to be, basically, is like the very emotional tone of it all. But I know, Theo, that you had kind of being asked to do something about femininity and how that felt to you. I wanted to hear that story.
Yeah. So my senior year of high school, I was on the like leadership team for at my parish's youth ministry, and myself and a couple of the other seniors were assigned. Actually, I don't know if we were assigned it, or if we might have even asked if we could do it. I don't remember, but we gave the like girls talk at the retreat. Each retreat, one day there was a girls talk and a boys talk, and we gave the girls talk. And yeah, I basically gave a whole long talk to the rest of the teenagers at the retreat, about like what it means to be feminine, and like how to embrace your femininity, which is just really funny to me now, when I think back on it. And it's funny because, I mean, first of all, yeah, when I think back on it, I just think like, that's just so funny that it was just like, and here's the non binary lesbian to teach you to be a good Catholic girl. It was just honestly. But then the other reason I think it's kind of funny is because I feel like when I came out, some people were really surprised, in part because of those things. And I sort of wanted to say, why do you think I was spending so much time thinking about this? Like, why do you think I was so obsessed with trying to figure out what is
Yes.
gender and what does it all mean?
Yes.
Like, there's a reason.
That is so well said, Theo. And that actually is one of my secret ulterior motives of why I asked you on this podcast, because I think you're so well spoken about like articulating how it feels to think about those things in the moment specifically. Like one thing I really liked about the podcast of Disordered is like I can feel the thought process as I'm listening to you and your guests talk about the issues, and it feels like how I felt thinking about those things when I was younger and trying to figure it out for myself. So just a little sidebar that I really I really do appreciate that. But I also wanted to say I sometimes feel like, okay, so two things. First, with like being asked to give a talk about femininity, or like in my case, to write a letter, I sometimes feel like that was sort of an assimilation attempt by others onto us, you know, like they were trying to course correct us a little bit. Like, come on, join us. Like, come over here to the cishet world where we are all normal and we're all doing it this way. So I feel that energy in particular. And then the second thing I wanted to say was about people being surprised when you came out. So I dealt with a little bit of that. There is a story, and it still hurts me to like think about it, to be honest, talking about being trans. And he basically said that he had never seen me as masculine. Yeah, the people being surprised thing, I feel like again is part of the same, like it's part of the same project of we are doing what we can to keep you roped in. Like we want you to continue acting a role, essentially, you know, like we're trying to like slip you hints like, okay, if you give this talk, like if we're surprised, then maybe it will discourage you from like continuing, because that's a whole other can of worms too, of like, well, you could always detransition, and I'm like, you're crazy. I will not be doing that, thank you.
Yeah, no, I definitely relate to that. I have definitely had it like many various experiences with that at one point. Like, I mean, just different people, like my youth minister, different priests, like giving me books, or one of them introduced me to someone who that they happen to know who like studies theology of the body, like just stuff like that, just sort of like trying to like rope me into conversations and situations of like, yeah, of like, oh, seems like maybe we need to nudge you back in the right direction. I had one experience as well. I was at a retreat. It was a Catholic women's retreat, and I had just so right before the retreat, I had just gotten my hair cut, and it was like a pixie cut, basically. It was like a very, very short pixie cut. And one of the religious sisters who was running the retreat, like, sort of pulled me aside and, like, kind of a bit out of nowhere, like, started talking to me about how I shouldn't reject my femininity and how I should embrace my femininity. And it was just like so uncomfortable. And I was so self conscious then for the entire rest of the time. And, it was just like, I don't, it's when I think back on that now, I think, oh my goodness, why do people think that that kind of thing is okay? It so clearly isn't and shouldn't be considered an appropriate like thing to do to anyone.
And this is a good point too. It's that I thought of the word as well. It's policing. That level of policing. The thing is, like, and this is what the trans community has been saying, and we also see evidence of this, which is that if you're going to come after LGBTQ people so hard, you're also going to hurt cis people along the way. And that's the other thing too, is like, it's just plain ignorance to act like there is not any diversity in gender and sexuality presentation, even among cis het people. That is a hill I will probably die on, so I don't want to rant too long about this. I want to hand it back over to Emma because I think there was something else she wanted to add.
No, Max, I just wanted to absolutely affirm what you just said. Because I think more than anything, a lot of the research I've done has been about saints that identify with and resonate with many people who have PCOS like me, who like have hair that maybe based on our social and gender constructs would be considered masculine or wouldn't be considered feminine by default. In the same ways that that does not define what my gender identity is, nor does it define the gender presentation I give to someone else or I give to the wider world. In the same way that, just as you said, Theo, somebody making that assumption about the reasoning behind why you chose to cut your hair, or even making a comment in of itself, is completely inappropriate and harmful. In the same way that, like, I've been to, especially as someone with PCOS, I have been in conversations where people say, "I was wondering if you had PCOS. You have hair where we're not expecting you to have hair before, and your hair is really thick." And I was like, what a fun thing to say to a person. But it ties into long Catholic traditions. We even think about saints that had hirsutism, like Saint Wilgefortis specifically, folk saints that had really powerful devotional groups. We even think about traditions today on the Feast of Mary Magdalene, where tradition holds, even though there's not specific canonical gospel understanding, that Mary Magdalene went into the woods, and once her clothing fell apart, she grew hair all around her body to preserve her modesty. Some of those later on traditions. So just as you say, Max, I appreciate you saying that. But also, by default, by focusing and going after trans and non-binary and intersex people, we are hurting cis people.
What you were saying did remind me, though, of someone that I was friends with several years ago, and he was someone who had transitioned and then detransitioned. I'm going to use he, him pronouns because that's what he asked me to use. But he had previously identified as a trans woman, and he had detransitioned basically so that he could be in line with the church's teachings. But he still had long hair. That was like his one thing where he was like, I cannot let go of my long hair. Absolutely. Just need this. And basically his parish told him that he could not participate in ministries at their parish because they were uncomfortable with the way he looked, that he looked too androgynous. They didn't think you could tell clearly that he was a man by looking at him, and that they like basically wanted him to cut his hair. And for me, that was kind of one of the many experiences that I had or heard from others that was like kind of a real tipping point, because all I could think was, you have no idea how much this person has given up to live in accordance with your worldview and your values. And B, this person is following your rules, and it still isn't good enough. Like, he's done everything that he needs to do. There is no church teaching that says that your hair has to be a certain length depending on your gender at all. And somehow, like, it's still not good enough.
I feel this deeply in my soul. I was just resonating so much with that, because that's really the conclusion I came to as well, which was there's no actually satisfying them, because I was under the impression that the main thing that I could do with my life at the time was be single and have a career. And I was like, well, and I'll work in conservative Catholic media, which means that I'm giving my life to God, like, in the most complete way that I can. And if allegedly that these vocations are, if they are equal, if they are equally weighted, then this should be good enough. You know, I shouldn't have to consider vocations that don't align for me, that don't feel right. But it never was good enough. There were always the questions. There was always the probing. There were always the little comments of being pulled aside, like we're talking about, in whatever way it was. It was, and so I just had to pull that out because that really resonates.
100%. And I think, Theo, I'm really glad that you said that, because I think at the end of the day, it talks about that each one of us has had a tipping point in our experiences, many of us who have come to understand and live authentically as ourselves, that there will never be a space, a way that we present ourselves, a way that we dress, that we cut our hair, that we talk about ourselves or talk about our families and relationships that will be acceptable enough to communities that are homophobic and transphobic. In your eyes, Theo, what sparked finding this tipping point and what came next for you?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a culmination of a lot of those like experiences of my own and hearing experiences of others as well, kind of like coming together. Um, and then for me, I think where that like kind of really culminated was um, when the Pennsylvania grand jury report was released and the response to that, and just the number of Catholic figures who were so quick to scapegoat the queer community for somehow being responsible. And to me, that was felt like a big betrayal, because a lot of the people doing this were speakers and whatnot that I had really looked up to. And again, it was just that feeling of like, here I am, like ready to completely give my life to the church. I have compromised and given up so much. And like somehow it still isn't enough. Somehow you are still willing to just completely like turn on me and people like me, like the second that it's convenient for you. And so that was kind of a really big moment for me. And after that is when I kind of started to open myself up a little bit more to some different perspectives. I decided to kind of explore a little bit more like some affirming perspectives. I had kind of always, been given this narrative of that like Catholics who didn't follow the church's teachings, they, didn't take their faith seriously, or they were shallow, looking for the easy way out, like all that kind of
Mm,
thing. And I just
yeah.
kind of started to like question that as well and think, is that really true though? And so I decided to kind of go and find out, and started to engage more with like more affirming perspectives. And yeah, and just kind of discovered that, yeah, what I had been told was not true. There definitely were Catholics who were affirming and who took their faith very seriously and were wonderful people. Um, and then that kind of like really opened things up for me a lot more. And I kind of very slowly started to kind of, you know, deconstruct like all these kind of individual questions in the process of like eventually coming to like fully accept my own gender identity and sexuality.
100%. I really appreciate you sharing that. And so I think it fits so well into the conversation that we're having here, in that from this point, this tipping point of shifting away to, and I'd love for you to speak more to this, to studying theology, going to a Catholic university and experiencing those spaces of affirmation, people that were Catholic and were affirming to you, and possibilities of existing in this church, and but also existing outside of the church and retaining your connection to Catholicism on your own terms, I think is really important. How did that lead you to the work that you do today on your podcast, which I think is really significant in unpacking figures that have been especially harmful and perpetuating the same experiences that you went through?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was in college, yeah, definitely was a big period of change for me, and kind of for the first time experienced a different kind of Catholic environment. There was very much a mix of different, I think, perspectives of Catholicism, on my college campus. Um, and then after college, just kind of like continued on that like slow process of deconstruction, and eventually I did reach a point where I decided to stop practicing. It just kind of, I reached a point where it no longer felt authentic. I felt like I was only really attending out of fear or anxiety, of feeling that if I don't do this, God will be angry with me. Um, and so I eventually ended up kind of stepping away. Um, I no longer really identify myself as Catholic because my personal beliefs just, I think, diverge enough from the churches that it doesn't really make sense to describe myself that way anymore. But at the same time, being Catholic was such a major part of my life, for so much of my life, that I feel like it's not something that I can just get rid of. Like, it's still very much a part of what has made me who I am. And there are also still things about Catholicism that I do find beautiful. And I try to kind of retain the connection to those things. Um, and then that kind of inspired me to do the podcast, because I just really wanted to kind of take all of that time that I had spent kind of deconstructing and picking apart these issues, and hopefully kind of make it into something that might be helpful to someone else, as they're either thinking about those things for the first time, or just to feel even just like a sense of connection for someone else from someone else who has had the same questions. Um, and yeah, I just kind of, I guess, wanted to take those experiences and hopefully kind of turn it into something creative and something that can be helpful to other people.
I think it's amazing, and I do relate again on so many points. I think most of this episode is just going to be me saying yes, I relate. um, but specifically, like, this idea of, this is something we've Emma and I have talked about a lot in different formats, in writing, in podcasts, but it really does hit this idea that we still have something Catholic in our identity, no matter where we end up many times with deconstruction. And I think honestly that's one of the things that I enjoy most about like finding the community is we can still connect with all these different people no matter again where they end up, because we did have this very formative similar experience that comes with many like shared symbols, the smells and bells. I'm going to say it before Emma can. um, and yeah, and so then moving to a place where it brought you to something creative, I think that's highly important and worth noting too, because it's like you finally had an opportunity to do something of your own with this thing. Like after all of these years of like wrestling and inner torment, really, of like, well, I'm not supposed to do this and I can't do this. And if I try to do this, they're going to police me in this way or that way. You finally had the opportunity of like, well, what do I actually want to say about this? And so I think it's just a really incredible thing. And I really do think that the podcast is really amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot.
And I will totally agree with that as well, Theo. I think it's wonderful. I also want to highlight what you had said, Max, resonates. I just finished reading Brian McNaught's book, A Prince of a Boy. And something that we talked about here was the idea, he writes, in fact, people who must examine their faith as outsiders usually go a lot deeper than those who don't have to think about it at all, who implicitly have that privilege. That I think really resonates with what we're talking about today. With that being said, Theo, I also wanted to unpack that you do incredible work, just as you mentioned, providing the steps and the formative information for people to identify harmful systems, not only within the church, but specific Catholic leaders. I know you've taken apart and deconstructed some of the theology and the representation from Jason Evert and Father Mike Schmitz. What contributed to focusing on a model of like a sole representative of a leader in this field? What lent itself well to that model as a way to deconstruct?
Yeah, I think so. When I first kind of started the project, I originally was just going to kind of think of common arguments that I'd heard, kind of something along those lines. And as I was getting started, I kind of was finding it difficult. I kept sort of thinking or like anticipating that someone could maybe look at what I'm saying and sort of accuse me of making like a caricature of the argument or, something like that. And so I just kind of decided, you know what? This is maybe going to be easier if I actually have just like a specific concrete thing so that I can, instead of sort of trying to generalize, many people say something like this, I can actually point to a specific thing and say, this is exactly what I'm responding to.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then it was also the kind of the specific kind of individuals that I chose were all people who really shaped my experience, my formative
Mm.
years growing up Catholic. And so I think that was, I mean, for one thing, I just know they're extremely popular and really do have quite a lot of influence in this sort of Catholic zeitgeist.
Mm-hmm.
But also on a more personal note, I think it was also kind of felt really healing to me as well. Kind of like what you were saying before about like it was to take these things that I had heard and really had done a lot of harm to me growing up and be able to like give myself a voice and say this is what I have to say about that.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that specifically, like when I was listening, I really liked how you were able to build in some of the like foundational and like fundamental information that people like need to know. In the past, I had thought about different writing projects because I love writing. So I'm always like a million writing projects floating in my brain. And I always felt so overwhelmed by like, how do I like explain my experience when I didn't have knowledge or language, but then also like provide the knowledge and the language to the reader so that they can like get caught up. But then I'm also fighting the battle that so many Catholics like literally like have zero or sometimes negative information about this stuff. But in the podcast, it's so well done, and I think it was very wise on your part to like choose these already existing presentations, because then not only can you pull in and bring in the contextualizing information of like, here's your 101 little note here for those listeners who may not know, but also you can point out as they go the fact that their arguments don't actually make sense, which I think is like really important, because I feel like they're such big names and they're so popular, and within fundamentalism you're kind of just supposed to nod along to like the people who are like the leaders, but these arguments literally don't even make sense, like whether or not you actually like fundamentally agree with them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, like the other thing that to me I think was helpful about you having something, a specific book, talk, podcast episode to respond to is that I also really wanted to kind of highlight the like how covert some of the messaging is and how the way that they frame it and phrase it in a way to make it sound benign, to make it sound caring or compassionate, and how kind of insidious that is, that like this really is actually very harmful rhetoric, but it's hidden really, really well.
100%. Theo said, "Where are the receipts? Like you're making all these claims, like, but can you back it up?"
Yeah.
I just feel like as well, because a lot of what we're talking about is lived experience, and I think that that's the problem that the right has to deal with is like that there are LGBTQ people. They just don't want LGBTQ people to exist. So often it's like all these like minimizing strategies, or like, well, they're just confused, or da 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 da. Because the thing is, at the end of the day, if you do try to argue with lived experience, you're essentially at risk of becoming a bully, because you're basically saying, no, you can't be this. And if you're insistent about it and you're pushy about it, you're a bully. Like, that's at the end of the day what you've become.
100%. And more than anything, I love how you phrase that, Max, as well as Theo. I love the idea too that it's kind of taking away the fallacy that people can be like, well, that's a straw man argument. You're just building a construct of what we would say. And you're like, no. These are legitimate tweets. These are legitimate videos pulling out the receipts, just as Max said. But I think also, just as you talk about, it's very much humanizing kind of these larger than life figures. I think within the Catholic Church recently, and we've talked about this in the High Control series, there's kind of this cult of personality where some series take on this kind of like larger than life persona. Especially John Everett and Father Mike Schmitz, but also figures like Michael Voorhees, like key people in the community that recently, as a result of people who are calling out systemic abuses and abuses of power, are being held accountable for the damage that they do. It reminds me, when we were discussing and planning this conversation, one of the things, just as you talk about covert things, on Ascension Press from Father Mike Schmitz has a specific example of the question, can I attend a same-sex wedding? It's one of those pieces where it is talking about Kim Zember and her mom, basically, when, as they say, Kim was living a homosexual lifestyle, when her mother full on came to her and said, like, this is a gospel moment. This is an evangelization moment. If you have a wedding with someone of the same sex, I will not attend. I will not be there for you. And I think it's very much just as you talk about, it's not talking about the idea that homosexuality is wrong. It's couching it in the phrase of, just as you talk about earlier, evangelizing through relationships that breeds in authenticity, but also intense stress of who is really being real friends or not, and what the purpose of those relationships are.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, I feel like for me, at least, as I've kind of processed some of the effects of that environment, I feel like for me, one of the ones that has been the most impactful in my day-to-day life is the feeling of anxiety and not being able to take people at their word. I still struggle with anxiety around, like, someone will say, I don't know, use my correct pronouns, and I'll still feel anxiety. I'll be like, but do you actually, but are you secretly trying to manipulate me? Are you doing that to trick me? And it's some people, I think, who haven't had some of these experiences might think like that seems really irrational. But it's like, no, when you've had these kind of experiences where it feels like everyone is trying to sort of secretly trick you into thinking you're safe so that they can influence you and how you feel about your identity, like, it does breed that level of anxiety at feeling like, can I trust anyone? Can I take people at their word, or are they trying to manipulate me?
Or certainly even the whole concept of like fair weather friends. I mean, there might be an even better term for that, but just this fact that, I think we've all experienced that, where we had people who were like part of our whole social world. For me, I also worked in Catholic media at the time, conservative Catholic media. So it was not just my social life, but also my professional life. And then when I transitioned, I had a few people who kind of like pushed in there and asked invasive questions like, well, who are you attracted to? Because that really matters for if, if they're going to view me as like super, super sinful or just like a little sinful, I guess. But the large majority like just completely vanished overnight. So I resonate with that too, of like, there's always still just a little extra level of being guarded, because it's like, we know what it's like when being in a high control environment where it's like, oh, no one's forcing anybody. Okay. there are coercive elements here because of the theology that has levels of like, if you don't do this, this is going to happen to you. So, yeah.
100%. And I'll just want to also highlight the exaltation of the idea of purity and virginity being the only value that I can bring, alongside in like a very natalist purity culture society that the only value I can bring isn't having children. And knowing as someone with PCOS, that's probably not going to happen, even if I wanted to have children. So in that same way, I think what you highlight is incredibly important in how mental health wise. This is not our deconstruction process is also deeply laden with understanding the nuances and the politics of our relationships. So this process doesn't just mean coming to understand ourselves, it means coming to understand the communities and families and people around us that form our communities.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And something that I'm really, I don't really passionate about trying to I guess make clear to people who kind of say that like, well, the church has a long history of celibacy and lots of people are celibate in the church, and like it's not a big deal to ask people to be celibate, kind of thing, is like it's not really. I'm not going to say that the concrete fact of you cannot have a relationship has no effect. Like it definitely does have an effect. But I really do feel that the much bigger effect is the way that teaching teaches you to feel about yourself. Like for me, when I left behind the church's teaching and really decided I don't agree with that and I'm not going to live by it, my mental health improved. My ability to have authentic relationships with other people improved. And it had nothing to do with whether or not I was having sex. Like, that was not the issue. It was about how I felt about myself and how healthy my relationships were. And so I think people kind of get stuck on that issue of, oh, you're making it all about, they're like, oh, you just want to have sex. No, no, no. It's really not it. That is a side note.
Theo, 100%. In many ways, I really appreciate you saying that because it was the same situation for me. Even when this was about my sexuality and my sexual orientation, the fact that it was like hitting my mental health breaking point was the point of giving myself permission to deconstruct. It was actually back in 2022 writing a story for The Revealer, an NYU publication, about Taylor Tomlinson's Netflix special Look at You, about her depictions of purity culture. One of my favorite moments is that she includes a joke in her special that says, quote, "I grew up with God. He's a douchebag, all right. Did he tell you you were broken and you need him? That's his move. That's what he does. He says that to everyone. Don't drink what he gives you. You drink that, next thing you know, you're eating his body. The Holy Spirit's inside you. It's a whole system they have over at that frat house called church. Who else uses Roman numerals?" And so I think writing that piece and giving myself permission to accept the abuses that have happened in my own life was a moment where it triggered for me definitely a mental health change, to the point where I gave myself permission not only to see myself as who I was and to explore who I was, but permission to ask for help, and to ask for help professionally outside my family. So I invite everyone listening, wherever you are in this process. Max and I have spoken with a wonderful therapist, Teresa Thompson, who shared more grounding exercises that we went through, as well as resources of national hotlines. We recognize now that under the current administration, there's been the acts of the LGBTQ plus youth suicide hotline. It's very much a campaign against the survival of our very selves, our younger selves and the younger people today. But also consider this and consider all of these conversations an invitation to give yourself permission not only to think critically about what information you hear, but also to reach out for help and reach out if you have questions when you need them. For the first time, when I gave myself permission to love who I was and to be who I was, and permission also to understand that challenging and thinking critically about things instead of turning a blind eye or accepting compliance when I felt that things weren't as they should be, gave me a space of liberation to feel all of those feelings, even if they were really difficult things to process. So more than anything, I'm just really grateful, Theo, that you've been here and you've contributed to this conversation. The work you do on your podcast is incredibly reticent, powerful, and important. you're impacting the next generation of people that are navigating what that tipping point looks like and when they're going to hit it. And I think now more than ever, that is incredibly important.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Something when I was young that really stuck with me that I feel like was very helpful later on, as I started to give myself permission to deconstruct, was when I was really young, the concept of God as truth like really hit me. And I don't know why, but I found it fascinating. The statement that God is truth. I was like, okay. And later on, when I was kind of needing to start deconstructing, thinking to myself, like, if God is truth, then there's nothing that is true that I have reason to be afraid of. So as long as I'm looking for the truth, I'm good, right? And so I just found that really, really helpful as I was trying to get started.
100%. I think that's a really good example of how, again, with we do have a foundation, a foundation of spirituality, and within that world of Catholicism, there is much more variety and diversity than we were really led to believe within the fundamentalist and the high control part of it all. And at the heart, the very, very basic messages of love God, love your neighbor. Like, these are very simple things that you find in many, many religions for a reason. They are good advice. And so I think that's a good moment to pull it to a close, is that, there is a way to be true to yourself and be true to the understanding of God that you had that did bring benefit to your life, no matter where you ultimately end up.
Our conversation with Theo is a reminder that theology isn't neutral. It shapes lives, for better or worse.
And for so many queer people raised in fundamentalist spaces, the harm isn't theoretical. It's personal, embodied, and lasting.
But Theo shows us it's possible to name the harm, unpack the teachings, and still move toward healing.
Their podcast, Disordered, is a powerful example of what happens when we stop trying to fit into broken systems and start building something new.
We're grateful to Theo for sharing their story and for creating space for others to do the same, including Max and myself on the episode today.
As always, thanks for listening, and stay with us as we keep pushing for a more honest, liberating faith.
Goodbye!